Welcome everyone to this very special occasion, which is the inaugural lecture of Professor Ceri Morgan. My name's Nick Seeger, I'm the head of the School of Humanities. I first met Ceri the night before my interview at Keele, when she took some of the candidates, including me, for dinner, which made for a really warm welcome and set the precedent for lots of sociable occasions and a long-lasting friendship, which I'm sure is the same for many colleagues and guests here tonight. Ceri is the eldest of four daughters of physics teacher Ceri Morgan and occasional infants and primary supply teacher Lynn Morgan. She studied at the University of Southampton, where she gained her BA in French and English in 1993. After a year spent working in London and Ryde on the Isle of Wight, she returned to the University of Southampton to undertake an MA and then PhD on the literary geographies of post-1960 Quebec fiction, supported by the Humanities Research Board of the British Academy. Ceri spent part of her PhD programme as a stagiaire de recherche at the Université de Québec à Montréal in 1997. She began working at Keele in September 1999, first as a temporary and then permanent lecturer in French. She was repositioned into English in 2008, and since then, Ceri has taught increasingly in creative writing. A place writing researcher and practitioner, Ceri often works on participatory projects using creative writing and other arts practices to make place-based art with a range of people in and outside of academia. Recipient of several research awards and prizes, including an AHRC Research Leave Award, a visiting Ekin Fellowship at McGill University in Montreal, a Leverhulme International Academic Fellowship, and 3 British Academy Small Research Grants, as well as prizes from the Quebec and Canadian governments. Ceri is currently working on an AHRC Leadership Fellowship titled Heartlands/Pays de Coeur, Geohumanities and Quebec's Regional Fiction. Ceri's publications include the literary geographies monograph, Mindscapes of Montreal, Quebec's Urban Novel, in 2012, and prose poems and creative nonfiction in outlets such as Nowie, Writing and Education, Nightingale and Sparrow, Forge Zine, Geohumanities, and New Welsh Review. I think we're in for a real treat with Ceri's talk tonight. As you can see from the slide, it's titled Mindscapes, Heartlands, Place Writing, and Geohumanities. So join me in welcoming to the stage Ceri.
So thanks, Nick, for that really lovely introduction. I did say to people before we came in, no, don't make me cry at the start of the evening. I'm okay to cry at the end, but you obviously didn't listen to me. But thank you. Thanks also to everyone who's here, both in person and online. I know all my family and many of my friends are watching virtually, so thanks for that. Okay, then. I'm a Valleys woman who grew up in a house full of books. I'm a Québécoise d'adoption, a wannabe Montréalaise or Montrealer. This lecture is dedicated to a close Montreal-based friend, the late Jared Rudy, a social historian at McGill University and all-round a fun and generous person. Here he is at Gladstone Museum during a visit a few years ago. I'm a researcher and practitioner, as Nick just highlighted. So as a critic, I work on literary geographies and contemporary Quebec fiction. As a creative practitioner, I'm a prose poet and creative nonfiction writer. I also work in critical creative writing and participatory arts, as suggested by its name, a bringing together of approaches from geography and arts and humanities is typical of the subdiscipline known as geohumanities. I am a passionate reader, love words, and am interested in what reading and writing can do. French is my second language, Welsh is my third, English is my sometimes uncomfortable first. In what follows, you'll mainly hear English, but there'll be some phrases in French and the occasional Welsh term. We can think of these words as way pavers, although it's best I don't propose taking you on a journey in this lecture, unless, that is, you're willing to get lost, wander, pause, and begin again. Instead, I'll offer some moments, mixing my creative and critical work as I've done throughout my career, with the first moment taking us, of course, to Montreal. This first poem contains a quotation from José Yvon's countercultural novel, Danseuse Mamelouk, published in 1982, which, in its portrayal of Montreal's erotic dancers, is inspired by documentary photographer Susan Meiselas's Carnival Strippers. In the early 1970s, Meiselas photographed women working small-town carnivals in New England, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina. The resulting exhibition and book included extracts from interviews with the women, as well as images of them, so as to ensure their voices were represented. Highly educated and from a middle-class family, José Yvon nevertheless chose to live in working-class neighborhoods on or near Montreal's Rue Ontario all her life, depicting her milieu with empathy. For a while, I lived on the same street. Rue Ontario, Montreal. In my memories, I cut across Montreal, head full of novels and feet in flat shoes. June mornings, turquoise sky, treacly tobacco factories, glittering fleuve, dancers Mamelouk in backpack and mind. From Fulham to UQAM, passing looming churches, a shop selling hubcaps, the neighborhood bakery that reminded me of Beauvais, tasting corne de gazelle for the first time. One evening, a car began to follow me. I strode on, hands in the pockets of my too-thin winter jacket and terror in my mouth like held breath. The driver gave up, likely took me for one of the sex workers hanging out by the fast food place. I went there to get tofu dogs, layering green sauce and mustard. In the car park, women scrambled leggily into trucks. In '97, the Centre Sud was all brick and concrete, blistering by July. My gardenless neighbors and folded deck chairs outside duplexes sat chatting into the dark, carefully saving beer bottles for deposits refunded at the dépanneur. 1970s clothes were worn in non-hipster mode. Years later, I would walk out of a vintage store on Saint-Denis when told I was too fat to try on the skirt in my hand. I think of José Yvon and Denis Vanier crossing the street where they lived, bold and beautiful in vest tops and tattoos. Nous sommes absolus, vulgaires, obscènes, mal habillés, badly dressed, but in a good way. This prose poem, published in Forge Zine last year, is part of a number of Montreal poems I began 5 years ago. A mix of life writing, travel writing, and urban literature, they pay tribute to the city's writers and artists, while celebrating what colleague and friend Daniel Laforêt describes as, and I quote, ma deuxième ville, my second city. Rue Ontario draws on a time during my PhD that was mentioned in the introduction to this lecture. Although I studied mainly at the University of Southampton, where I was supervised by Bill Marshall, pictured here, with additional supervision from Alison Blunt, I spent 6 months at l'Université du Québec à Montréal. There I was taught by Louise Dupré, Barbara Havercroft, and the late Laurie Saint-Martin. 10 years later, I was living in the city again, working on an HRC-funded project on the post-1960 French-language Montreal novel, or roman montréalais. Mindscapes considers how creative prose, mainly novels, contributes to a conceptualizing of Montreal as a city of neighborhoods. Interested in the relationship between real and imagined geographies, it seeks to make interventions in both literary studies and geography, as espoused by Sheila Holmes. Was conceived of as a literary geographies project, Mindscapes can now be seen as an example of what Lieven Emil terms urban literary studies, or literary urban studies, rather. It engages some of the debates associated with urban studies more broadly, such as paradigmatic or so-called world cities versus so-called ordinary cities, flânerie or wandering in the city, and a layering of pasts and presents and potentially futures. When researching the project, I learned about a key trope within Montreal fiction and urban literature more generally, namely walking or other mobilities, such as driving, cycling, and also not walking or restricted walking. Here's an example from my favorite Montreal novel, Nicole Brossard's French Kiss, published in 1974. Although mainly written in French, this experimental text puns and dances across both French and English, playing on the connotations of langue, tongue, as both body part and language, to suggest a coming together of the two sides of a city historically split between a francophone East and Anglophone West. The kiss of the title takes place between francophone Camomille Delphi and anglophone Lucie Savage at the corner of Rue Sherbrooke and Rue Saint-Denis. The kiss is projected in the route driven simultaneously by Marielle, also known as Elle or she in English, a friend of the two women, who drives from east to west and back again along Montreal's longest street. Elle, Camomille, and Lucie belong to a group of 5 friends who spend their time exploring the urban, the others being Georges, geography, and Alexandre, Lexa. As I'm sure might be expected from this summary, Brossard's novel brings together place, notably Montreal, words, languages, bodies, and desire. And I'll read the French, but you'll see the English translation by Patricia Claxton on the screen. Camomille Delphi, Louvre de fiction, se berce sur son ombre. Passage assez clair de Camomille à Marielle des Aulniers, rue Sherbrooke. On file 40 000 à l'heure dans le réel. Sur l'asphalte, en Plymouth, vieille décapotable mauve, couleur de 1965. On roule habituellement entre l'appartement de la rue Coloniale et les édifices de la rue Stanley. Mais aujourd'hui, croisière urbaine, suivre la rue Sherbrooke d'un bout à l'autre, de l'est à l'ouest, de l'ouest à l'est, manège historique et géographique. Fin de citation. So this trope or theme of mobility then, mobility in the city, took on a particular relevance for me after I got Lyme disease in Canada in 2014. I started working on walking, as it was a mode of mobility I could no longer take for granted. It was also, and remains, a key transport mode for me as a non-driver. I should flag here, of course, that informed by the work of the late Sue Porter, I use the term walking to refer to a range of mobility practices, and not all of which are bipedal. I've had reduced physical mobility since 2014, which has been further reduced by 2 COVID infections. And I've combined an interest in what John Ery terms, and I quote, the most egalitarian of mobility systems, end of quote, with a commitment to participatory working. Envious of reading about geography projects involving individuals and communities outside academia, I saw training in participatory methods by a Leverhulme International Fellowship, which I spent at the Centre for Oral History and Digital Storytelling at Concordia University in parts of 2014 and 2015. There, I received training in oral history interviewing, digital audio recording and editing, and geomapping, and did some in-situ and walking interviews with Quebec authors like William S. Messier, Hélène Guy, and Brigitte Renaud, and Michel Plomer. My second poem is a mobilities poem. Published in Geohumanities, it's one of 4 written as a tribute to Brossard's French Kiss, with each featuring a different season, different location or neighborhood in Montreal, and a kiss. This poem is set on Rue Coloniale, where Brossard's characters live, and coincidentally, where my friend, the feminist writer Martine Delvaux, lived for a number of years. It therefore includes quotations from both Brossard and Delvaux. Avenue Rue Coloniale. Une fois, One time, once upon a time which curled and curved. Marielle's on Rue Sherbrooke in her mauve convertible. I'm walking on Colonial, past the store selling lavender chocolate, the gay sauna puffing occasional breaths of steam. I'm heading towards Rachel, where I buy still warm nata, tipping my tongue to the caramelized custard crust. Slipping on a vintage coat in the friperie, I look in the dusty mirror, embrace the blue-gold day. Store windows glint purple as Elle's char glides by. Slush puddles shine. Canaille in my earphones, I turn on my heels, stride back the way I came, glance at my watch to see both hands meet. Rue Coloniale, a no-man's land of potager improvisé. The dead-eyed dogwoods fix me in their sights. A meeting at the corner of Duluth. I touch my face to his, smile as I think of violet eyes. French kiss, introduire la langue dans la bouche de l'autre. Lips, teeth, bump, smack, and chatter settle into semi-somnolent rhyme. Grime on the sidewalk, the boots of passers-by, winter's loosening. My turquoise ski jacket makes some men stare. Then Harriet, I'm dazzled by you. You're marvelous, delicious in my mouth. The bobbleheads wobble in the tea shop window, salt-cod croquettes catch on the air. Sur Colonial, on se berce dans la cuisine. Record my friend reading with the thrum of the city, the laugh in her voice, traffic sounds. So I pursued one of the ideas that came out of the work undertaken at the Centre for Oral History and Digital Storytelling in a collaboration with media artist Philippe Lichty in 2016, a digital map of Montreal fiction. British Academy funded Fiction of Montreal, Montréal Fictif, featured a small number of audio recordings of authors reading short extracts of their published fiction in French or English. These recordings were pinned to points that approximated the locations of the fictional settings. Readers of the map could click on an icon and listen to performances by David Homel, Madeleine Thien, Raoui Haj, Dimitri Nasrallah, Marie-Célie Dagnan, Nicole Brossard, André Carpentier, and others. Of course, there's a vast body of scholarship on maps, but as post-colonial and indigenous scholars have taught us, they're bound up in power relations. So it's very easy to invite engagement and challenges in the form of countermaps. Drawing on the work of emotional geographies by theorists like Liz Bondi and Divya Tolya-Kelly, as well as Christian Knowles' work on biomapping, I sometimes ask workshop participants and creative writing students to draw emotional maps, which bring together on one page key places that are important to them. Our experiences of places are, of course, informed by memories, thoughts of, or fantasies about other places, and this exercise helps to concretize that. The exercise is also useful, of course. It's useful preparation for producing a piece of writing that layers multiple temporalities. Another legacy of my time spent at the Centre for Oral History and Digital Storytelling was that I began to design and lead or co-lead participatory art workshops and events. A long-time member of the Montreal-based geopoetics research group La Traversée, I've been very influenced by the work of colleagues there, especially by that of co-founder Rachel Bouvet. I owe her a huge debt, in fact. In Vers une approche géopoétique, Bouvet describes some of the practices of La Traversée, notably, et je cite, les ateliers nomades, fin de citation, collective geopoetics creative practice workshops organized around a theme and involving immersion in a particular place. For those of you unfamiliar with geopoetics, self-professed founder Kenneth White describes it as a, and I quote, world writing, end of quote. White suggests the term applies, quote, not only to poetry, but also to art and music, and can be extended into science and even social practice, end of quote. Geopoetics has affinities with deep ecology in that it aims to think about the connectedness of all things on and beyond this planet, and challenges human self-claimed position at the top of Earth's species hierarchies. In the participatory art I've made with others, I've combined elements from geopoetics, notably collective creative site engagement, with elements from other subdisciplines and approaches, such as oral history, what Hayden Lorimer terms walking studies, feminist writing, especially Brossard's notion of a space and time outside what she sees as masculinist space-time, performance, and psychogeography, particularly the dropping out of regular routines associated with Guy Debord's notion of the dérive or drift, and the playfulness of contemporary psychogeographer, artist, and theorist Morag Rose. In a spirit of deeply intellectualized play, then, I tried to foster moments of creative conviviality. Considering creativity in everyday activity, I tried to play with its potential to reimagine spaces and places that are hopefully inclusive, that respect memories bound up in a place, but allow both for a diversity of memories and the making of new, present, and future ones. I'll just offer a few very brief examples. Memories of Mining was a geopoetics walk I led in Silverdale Country Park to mark the 50th anniversary of the Aberfan disaster in 2016. Creative texts and interview material generated by participants featured in an exhibition the following year at Silverdale Community Library, and subsequently went on to form the basis of a participatory show in a collaboration between the Dawdlers, a walking, reading and writing group I founded in 2017, and a participatory performance company, Restoke. And this collaboration was fostered by friend and colleague, the environmental historian Ben Anderson. A community walk co-designed and co-led with socially engaged Nicola Winstanley in 2019 looked at art and gentrification in Longport and Middleport in Stoke. A collaboration with dancer moving image artist Anna MacDonald and bioethicist Anthony Wrigley, Circling and Circling Again, considered chronic or persistent pain and its impact on everyday life. My current project brings together literary geographies and participatory creative geohumanities. One of the things that have been nagging at me since my PhD was the focus on Montreal in post-1960 Quebec fiction. There are many reasons to explain why Montreal becomes the dominant setting in literature in Quebec's majority languages of French and English from the middle of the 20th century onwards. The city is the economic and cultural centre of the province, its historic home to a concentration of Anglophones, and it's a pole of immigration. But I knew this wasn't the whole picture and wanted to find out more about Quebec's regions. I began some pilot projects in the early 2000s, supported by small grants from the Canadian and Quebec governments. Very fortunately for me, the 21st century has gone on to see an explosion of creative prose on and of Quebec's regions, such as Saguenay, Gaspésie, and the North Shore, and elsewhere. My project, an HRC Leadership Fellowship entitled Heartlands Pays du Cœur, Geohumanities and Quebec's Regional Novel, focuses on one of these, the Eastern Townships and l'Estrie in southeastern Quebec. So just to clarify a little then, the Eastern Townships don't coincide exactly with the administrative region of l'Estrie, which was established in 1981. In fact, l'Estrie is much smaller. Or the same, I use the terms Eastern Townships and Townships to refer to the literary production on and of both the historical, cultural, and administrative regions, as these terms are still used by residents and are meaningful and inform imaginary geographies of the region. Bordering the United States, the Eastern Townships are often popularly identified with Loyalist settlement. But the Wobaniak, Abenaki is the anglicized term, lived there long before the arrival of settlers. These settlers came first from America and then from Britain and elsewhere in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The townships have long been tourist and leisure destinations. Less well known outside the region is their industrial history, linked to mining, pulp, paper, asbestos, the railway, and textiles. Technological developments overseas, the outsourcing of labour and other factors saw the first effects of deindustrialization in the 1950s. By the turn of the millennium, the region was experiencing many of the traits associated with deindustrialization worldwide, such as the decline of small towns, unemployment, and youth exodus. Now, in terms of regions, the Eastern Townships are especially interesting, since unlike some of the other regions celebrated in Quebec's 21st century literature, they have been associated with creative writing in both English and French for over 60 years. A primarily English language poetry scene reached its peak in the 1960s and included well-known writers Ralph Gustafson, D.G. Jones, and Michael Ondaatje. More recently, the Eastern Townships have been linked with French language literature and prose, in fact, especially literary fiction and genre fiction. Genre and middlebrow fiction in English are thriving too, notwithstanding the fact that much of it is produced by a single internationally best-selling author, murder mystery writer Louise Penny. As you can see from a glimpse of some of the covers of the hundreds of books set in the townships, creative prose set in the region varies significantly. But for the literary geographies component of the Heartlands project, I've identified four main tendencies, namely the pastoral or anti-pastoral, border fictions, murderscapes or deathscapes, and deindustrialization literature, albeit a deindustrialization literature that looks very different from that associated with the US Rust Belt or certain English cities in the UK context. The geohumanities component of the project sees or will see me working with artists and community members to create new artistic responses to the region. These artistic outputs include a digital map, which I'm making in collaboration with media artist Kelsey Swain, with additional support from Yannick Guéguin, and an audio walk, which I'll be making with Philippe Lichty. The audio walk will form the basis of some geopoetics activities, with members of La Traversée, people living in the townships, and Restoke. Participants in these activities then would be invited to trial the walk and make their own creative responses to the sites it runs through or references. As creative geohumanities interventions, the participatory elements of the Heartlands project focus on bodies in places, experimentation, and process rather than outputs. Indeed, given that any output activities will be undertaken later this year, in summer and autumn 2023, it remains to be seen at this point in time what outputs will actually look like. However, although they'll be informed, of course, by my readings of Townships fiction and creative nonfiction, they will go in Danielle Fuller's and Danelle Rebeck-Sebdo's words, and I quote, beyond the book. They'll also go beyond the page or even written word. As we know, and as I hope is evident in what I've said so far, work is a collective undertaking. Indeed, I could have spent the last 30 minutes reading out a list of the names of people who have supported me professionally and personally. I'll just offer some very undeservedly brief thanks here. And I'll start with my lovely modern languages colleagues and friends, former Programme Director Paul Reed, Peggy Chaplin, Tracy Lee, Natalie Lowndes, Robin Bell, and of course my lovely friends, very long-term and loyal friends, Concha Perez and Ilse Vera. I'd like to thank my English and creative writing friends, colleagues and students. I thank and miss the late Roger Pooley, who welcomed me so warmly and unreservedly into the English programme in 2008. I've got some special thanks to creative writing colleagues, including postgraduates or PGRs, who've really supported me in becoming a published creative writer. I've worked with some for many years now, especially Daniel Scantlebury and Sylvia Crawley. I have to thank my heads of school, notably especially Susan Bruce and Nick Seeger, who encouraged and supported my promotions. I need to thank PSS colleagues for helping me function, basically. I'm neurodivergent. I need to also, of course, thank my mentors, of course, Bill Marshall, without whom I literally would not be here, Rosemary Chapman, Rachel Killick, Danielle Fuller, Mihaela Kellerman, Claire Holdsworth, David Amigoni, Alana Tompkins, Stephen High, Will Straw, and Sherry Simon. Role models are very important in life, of course. Mine include Mariangela Palladino, Barbara Kelly, Kate Cushing, Fabian Emmerich, Sergei Conarte, Becky Richards, Kay Tong, Caroline Merritt, Bernadette Bartlam, and community members, Linda Albert, Sue Moffat, and other local Unite members. I need to thank Quebec and Canadian Studies colleagues, writers, artists, collaborators, and friends, notably Cynthia Kelly, Mathieu Lapointe, and Magda Farney. I need to thank Kiel friends, Stoke-based friends, and artist collaborators, including Caroline Whitehand, Alfonso Miranda, and Adriana Aguilera, Eva Giro, Marie Jacob, Ben Anderson, Pavas Bish, Anthony Wrigley, my reading circle and fellow lockdown band members, Nick Bentley and Jim Peacock, Rhys Stoke, Urban Wilderness, and Nick Winstanley, who Nick and I worked together a lot on artistic activities and outputs. I'd like to thank my Birmingham friends, including the late Marga Lewis and Nace Moore. The Microclimates gang, with special thanks to Emma Bolland and Morag Rose for listening to me practice this lecture. Really helped get me here today. Obviously, I need to thank my grandparents, parents, my amazing sisters, Catherine, Krista, and Claire, Myre, Peter, Anne, and Tom, and my son, Gwilyn Hewitt, my life's joy. Thanks to Wyn Griffith, Steve Hewitt, and Mo Manga for forbearance and occasional enthusiasm. Finally, and this is a bit where I might start to cry actually, finally I really need to thank my life's companions. Delith Lewis, Martine Delvaux, Dominique Belkadi, Hitomi Tobe, Anne Ayerson, and Erica Arthur. Je vous aime. I'll finish then with a regional poem published last year in Naui Writing and Education, included in a special part issue of the magazine dedicated to microclimates, an online reading and writing group I set up in response to lockdown in April 2020. And indeed, it is a lockdown poem inspired by Dee Hedden's commission for the National Forest, entitled The Walking Library for Forest Walks. Although the poem isn't set in eastern townships, it is about a Quebec region, specifically the North Shore, and it's called In the Absence of Trees. In the absence of trees, I offer spruce at Tadoussac, where orthogneiss rocks frame the bay. My sister and I spent mornings on the beach, reading novels and crumbling croissants as clouds collected up the Saguenay. Afternoon storms sent us to the red-roofed hotel for Shirley Temples. We sipped distractedly, whilst through the bar's windows minkies played in the rain-pocked sea. With no leaves to be seen, I proposed Les Îles Mangan, looming limestone spun by ice and wind, boreal forests of gaunt, knowing firs. I went there one mid-August morning, setting out in the mist from La Promenade des Anciens in Arles Saint-Pierre. A curious humpback swam up to our boat, looked me in the eye, dipped away. With no bark to touch, I dreamed the pre-tundra, stretching across the windscreen on the 4-hour ride to Sept-Îles. The driver told jokes the whole time, tapping the side of my thigh at each punch in a way that was friendly, not sexual. I smiled, stared past the wipers at the leadening peat bogs, solemn in the slanting rain. At the 50th parallel, French had a whistling, whispering sound. I couldn't understand it all, no matter how I tried.